Welcome to the first talk of the day for the Scolato Parent Briefings. The format for these is that we have, they're very short, so we have about 20 minutes of Q&A on the stage, and then open it up to questions from the audience afterwards. And the topic for this one is about different kinds of boarding. So full, weekly, flexi, what works best for London families? That's what we're going to be trying to unpick from the stage. I've got a really fantastic panel to help with discussing this question. So Chris Wheeler, who's principal of Monkton, Combe, and then Tom Rogerson, who's head of Cottesmore, and Sarah Twigger, who's head of marketing at Seaford College. So I'm going to ask them to tell me a little bit about their schools and the kind of boarding they have in their schools so that we can understand where they're coming from. So perhaps you'd like to begin.
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing I'd do, if I may, is slightly challenge the premise of the question, because what you said was, what boarding is right for London families. And I think what we need to focus on is what is right for children, and that's not always the same thing, particularly because one of the things that one sees is differences between what parents think they might want to do with their children and what the children might look to do. And I think that's really important to think about when you're thinking about boarding. There's a sort of old-fashioned sense that boarding is sending children away. We think about it as being much more kind of choosing to engage in a partnership with a school, with a whole series of professionals, so that you're co-parenting, you're working with other people, you're sharing what is a complicated circumstance, and you're giving your children an opportunity to engage with their peer group much more fully than you would at other times. So if I can start there, but I'll then do what you asked me to do, which is say a little bit about Monkton. So Monkton is a deliberately smaller school just outside, a mile outside Bath. We are 300 in the prep school, 400 in the senior school, and full, and there is no desire or intention to change those numbers. That's the size that we feel we need to be in order to be able to focus on individuals. And individuals are really important at Monkton, within which, therefore, thinking about boarding, lots of it's about, actually what is the right time to board. I was an army child, so I was sent to boarding school as an 8-year-old. For me, that was probably 3 years too early. I have two older brothers who loved boarding school from the age of 8. They threw themselves at everything, and it was brilliant. And I have a sister who perhaps would have been better not boarding until she was in the sixth form. So I think right time is really important when you're thinking about boarding, as much as right model. When is it that your children are ready? For us, we therefore think about growing into boarding. I don't really like the phrase flexi boarding, if I'm honest, because it sounds a bit sort of, it's not putting the child at the centre. It's not thinking about what you really need to do. We talk about flexible boarding, to be sure, and we want to try and work with families to try and work out what's going to work for their children. We have about a third of boarders in year 7 and 8 at the top of our prep school, and then we're about 60% boarding in years 9 to 11, about 75% in the sixth form. And what you see, therefore, in the numbers is kind of playing out of, I suppose, what I was trying to say, which is at the right time, finding that opportunity for children to enter boarding and to be able to really grow and develop in their independence and to be able to move forward in that way. So that's sort of what we would say about boarding.
Can I just, because you've given a very good explanation of how it works through the age system, but I'm not clear in my head what the different kinds of boarding people do in the school. So forget the terms for a moment, but for some people who went to boarding school, boarding meant you went at the beginning of term, didn't perhaps see your parents till an exeat 2 or 3 weeks into term, and then you were there all the time till half term and so on. Is that what your boarding is, or
no,
that's what we're trying to understand?
Yeah. So we have a small number of weekly boarders. The vast majority of our boarders are what we would call full boarders. But when I talk about flexible boarding, that's really important, because actually it exactly isn't that piece of, okay, you go to school and you come back at the end of term. If it's Granny's birthday on Tuesday next week and you want to come down and take your children out, you take your children out. I went to one of my pupils' confirmation services last week, and his parents all came down, and that was what they did, and then they took him home afterwards. Yeah. So I think that's what's really important. It's not about, I think it's a slightly flawed premise that there is either full boarding or weekly boarding or flexi boarding. I think boarding is more complicated.
I totally get that there's a problem with the question, but what we're trying to unpick is what boarding actually means these days. That's and there are different varieties of it. So perhaps you'd like to tell us about Seaford's.
Working? So in case, hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Seaford. We are a beautiful school in 450 acres of listed parkland at the foot of the South Downs, near Petworth. Our closest train station is Hazelmere or Pulborough. And we have the benefit of the beautiful South Downs and then the coast with West Witterings and the Wittering Beaches near us as well. So it's a beautiful location. And the reason we attract London families is because you can come down quite easily from London. That either happens on a Sunday evening or a Monday morning to get to school, or you go back on a Friday night as a student to get back into London to spend time with your family. We're predominantly a weekly boarding school, so we're not a full boarding school. So if any of you went to a boarding school in the past where you were there throughout the whole term, and you maybe had exeat weekends and things like that, that isn't our structure at all. We describe it as fairly unique because it is very flexible based on the child and their needs and what they want to do, and also what suits the family. And because the location is fairly close to London, that's how we work it with London families. And also the home counties as well. So it's not just London. Lots of students board from the home counties. Interestingly, a lot of our boarders actually live locally as well. So I think we often think about boarding as a distance thing. So people are boarding because of the distance. Actually, lots of our students board because they want to board, because they see the benefits of what they get. So they get extra time in the evenings with teachers to help with prep work. They can go and do their music practice in the morning or in the evening in the music school. They can use our gym. They can go to the library and study. They can have fun with their friends. And they want to go on little trips and things that we do.
I'm going to interrupt it. We're really trying to move quickly, and we've got loads and loads of questions to ask. So, Tom, tell us about the kinds of boarding you have at Cottesmore.
My name is Tom Rogerson, as you well know, Guy, and I'm the headmaster of Cottesmore Prep School. And Cottesmore is a boarding school, and some might say it's from a more traditional it's a bit more of a traditional boarding school. I don't know if there are any boarding schools that where you drop your children off in September and pick them up in December anymore. I just simply don't think that exists. Apart from if you live in very far away, if you're from Beijing or whatever it is, and sometimes those families struggle to get over and do exeats. But at Cottesmore, we have, this term, for example, we have 4 exeats, 2 either side of half term. Next term, we only have 2 exeats, and then 3 in the summer. Cottesmore itself is again, quite similar to both these settings in that it's set in the most unbelievably beautiful countryside, and grass and trees and fresh air. We have a lake which we do paddle boarding on, and it's bucolic and wonderful. And the boarding is full. We don't have weekly boarding. The boarding is full, and so it's a very much of a traditional model at Cottesmore.
Okay, so that's great. So we've actually got something to compare now.
Exactly. Which is three very different setups.
Which is really good. So the first question I'm going to ask then, and this I think is relevant, well, it's relevant for all of you. If your child's starting boarding, is it easier mentally to cope with starting with a more immersive version, like Tom? And I remember that I've skin in the game in that I taught at Windlesham for 4 or 5 years in my 20s, and helped lots and lots of children start boarding. And Windlesham always had the argument that you needed a break from home to actually get into boarding. So the first exeat was always quite a few weeks into term, in the autumn term, to help children settle into it. And so I wonder whether weekly boarding and going home at the weekends actually makes it easier, or does it make it harder? Tom, what do you think?
We actually had weekly boarding, so I'm qualified to talk about weekly boarding for a very short amount of time, 15 years ago. I think the fact that we don't have weekly boarding now, and we used to have weekly boarding in 2008, 2010, I think that tells you the story. It's from a boarding aspect, it's we found it quite disruptive, and it wasn't fantastic. It didn't flow. They weren't getting stuck in as much as they could have. They were sort of half. They weren't quite there. They were half not there and half there. We find this model is clear. The full boarding model is that we offer, and it's very popular. We're one of the biggest co-ed prep schools boarding in the UK, and it works very well because we're very clear. And I completely understand flexibleness and flexi ideas, but I think sometimes it's from a knowledge or an understanding point of view, it can be a bit difficult because if you're everything, then people don't quite know. But if you're just one thing, which we are, it's a bit more simple and people can relate to it a bit more easily. But yeah.
Often what we find is our day pupils do some flexi boarding. So they might be in a production or going to a match on a Saturday. So they get into coming maybe on a Friday to stay over, so they're ready for that. And from the flexi boarding aspect, they then decide they'd like to board. So our approach is very much the child chooses. They often go home and say to their parents they want to board, and then it goes from there. And that's where the weekly boarding model has really grown for us. We think we're quite unique in that because we have very few full boarders. To put it into context, there's probably only about 20 or 30 full boarders out of our total boarding community. In the prep school, they start from year 7. And again, that's the same thing. They see their friends boarding, and they come home and they ask to board. So, and we haven't had any problems with people settling in, actually. But we do have a very big pastoral support system. So if anyone is feeling homesick, then we do support them, we help them. But I think they're so busy having so much fun and enjoying themselves that it really isn't a problem. And if they did start weekly boarding and they didn't like it, then they can take the days down, or they can choose to become a day pupil again. So there's no fixed term where you have to stay and board. So if there ever is a problem, it may be it's a year or two early for them.
Okay, I'm going to move it on.
Yeah.
We've got to try and be as brief as possible. With okay, Chris.
Okay. So I think there isn't one answer to the question because I think it's different for each child as to whether they're going to settle in better if they're more fully immersed or if they're there some of the time. But I would say I think keeping the child at the centre of it and understanding what's going on for them is essential. I think the change from home to school is the thing that can be slightly disruptive. They need a good run at what they're doing. So I would fall much nearer Tom's side of the argument. I think we don't really have weekly boarders. Those we do only weekly board for a year, and then they grow on beyond that. So I think it's very much sort of it's worth keeping the child at the centre of that and thinking about actually how do they really make sure that they get into life at school. The value of boarding, the real value of boarding is in the dead time. It's in the non-directed time. That's what you get in a boarding school that you don't get in a day school. It's incredibly valuable. And the time that they spend with one another. If you think about probably your own university careers, the time that you spent with people outside the formal education piece was the piece where you formed who you are, and that's what's really important.
Okay, so we're going to spin it. We've talked a bit about the value of these different choices for pupils, and you're going to have to think quite hard about what would suit your child in terms of different ways that you might begin boarding. But obviously parents are also thinking about how they're going to manage the school life for themselves as well. So the questions I've got for you here are about how often parents whose children are full or weekly or flexi boarding, how often they should expect to be coming to the school. The days when you waved your child off on a train at Paddington Station, and then they were marched up to school in a crocodile, and then you pick them up from Paddington, 10 weeks later, are gone, aren't they? And if your child is at a full boarding school like Tom's, you're probably going to be driving down there to see them doing things, I imagine.
We do actually wave them off at Victoria. Somebody's laughing at my jokes. Can you laugh louder? That's very, very kind of you. We do actually have a train service. It's at the Gatwick Express. But we also have a bus service, and it's the answer. The quick answer, I'm going to be very good because you want us to be quick. The quick answer is on Wednesdays we have matches. On Saturdays we have matches in the afternoon. It's a half day. We don't do any lessons. We have matches against other schools. That is a tea party. essentially. It's like you're going to watch Tottenham versus Chelsea. You come along, you watch the match, you come and have tea. And that's a very sociable occasion. You get to meet the teachers, you get to talk to everybody, and so you get to come down
times a week?
twice, a couple of times a week.
Couple of times a week.
And Sundays for special occasions.
Yeah. Okay, so that's quite a good thing to be, when you're thinking about schools, you want to make sure that it's somewhere that you can cope with travelling to a couple of times a week. That's quite an important factor. And it does mean for London parents, and I mean, there is a London aspect to this question. Getting out of London and heading across to the other side of London, for example, is a nightmare. And if you're doing that a couple of times a week, you probably would give up. So that means that schools tend to recruit from particular parts of London. I mean, and you look at the roads out, and that determines where people are looking. I'm imagining it's similar for everybody in terms of that.
Our parents can come down wherever they like, but they wouldn't necessarily have to come down twice a week. So a lot of students take the train on a Sunday evening, and we pick them up from either Pulborough or Hazelmere station to come to boarding. And the same, we organise taxis back on a Friday so they can head back themselves. So that's generally how it works. The prep school boarding for us is only Monday to Thursday, so that's not necessarily the best option unless you can make that trip. But of course, everyone's welcome on a Wednesday afternoon the same way for fixtures, and a Saturday where we have fixtures. We have welcome events and barbecues and other things.
We've got so many questions to get through. We've just got to go fast, all right? So unless, Chris, you've got something very different to say, let's move to another question.
Well, the difference is the prep school is quite like Tom. At the senior school, I wouldn't expect that level of engagement. Your teenage children will increasingly not be as enthusiastic about you coming down and engaging with the school that much, so the journey changes.
Yeah. So that's quite a factor. If you're thinking about, the age of your child, the travelling, the age of your child makes a difference to how far you might want to look.
Is that microphone spare? Should I give it to you when you roam?
We're meant to roam any second, actually.
Are you about to roam any second? Okay.
I don't think the time problem is passing of microphones, to be honest. Okay, so last question from here before we turn it to the floor. Do London children find the transition to a country lifestyle? I mean, it's obviously very attractive, but are there any difficulties in making that transition?
The usual type of London child. So quickly answer the last one. There's, a lot of our children come from Battersea and Fulham and all these sort of places. That it's a direct, route down the M23, whatever. A lot of the children do a lot of sport in London. Ironsides, rugby, that cricket team that play in Tooting. So it's not that much of a change in terms of the kind of wanting to do lots of sport. They do more sport, but there are some who are maybe slightly from the more central London that aren't quite so much into sport, and sometimes it's that's a bit of a change. The physicality of life at a boarding school is at Cottesmore, at least. They're doing sport every day, so you need to prepare yourself for that, being quite physical.
And is that true?
I would say for us, the child is choosing Seaford because of the facilities. So they can go to the gym in the evening, they can go to the library, they can use the grounds. Yep. That's why they're choosing us. So we don't generally find that is an issue. And they often describe it as a sleepover with their friends where they actually get to sleep. So actually, they really enjoy their time. So I would say that's why we're being chosen. So they're not missing London at all. And they can go back at weekends. So they get a bit of both.
Yeah, and to some extent I'd echo that. I think by the time you've chosen a school that is not in London, you've made that cultural shift. I don't think I'll ever forget the first Monkton pupil I met, to whom I said, sixth form girl, I said, what was your Monkton journey? She said, I came from London. I came down for the sixth form. I was in a big, rather pushy academic day girls' school. And I sort of went, wow, okay, big change. Small, country, pastorally focused boarding school. What was that like? And she fixed me square in the face and said, to be honest, sir, it was a bit like breathing for the first time. If it's the right thing for you, it's the right thing for you. And by the time you get to the school, you know that.
Great. Now, we've literally got about 5 minutes for questions, but we've got a small select group. So would anyone like to, we've got a fantastic panel here. Would anyone like to ask a question?
Very simple question. Where is Cottesmore?
I'm trying to be really accurate. Peas Pottage, that's the real answer. It's between Horsham and Crawley.
Okay.
It's half an hour from, as I said before, Victoria, straight down to Gatwick. We're 10 minutes away, in the middle of the countryside, just underneath there.
Okay, related question. Who do you feed to? Which schools do you feed to?
So I've given up talking about individual schools because it can be a bit insulting if you're left out. So I'll tell you afterwards, but I think you might be able to guess the schools the type of schools that we send children onto. It's usually the full boarding, perhaps the more traditional. That's not saying Cottesmore. There's an element of traditionalism, but also it's incredibly warm, and in some ways, in that way, quite liberal in elements. So schools like that, so traditional boarding schools.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll tell you the list of the schools afterwards.
That'd be great.
I've got another question over here. Sorry.
Hi. How many cases do you have of children which start boarding and then for some reasons they realize they don't like it, they really hate it, and then they just...
So
That's a really interesting question. Thank you.
it's a really interesting question. It occasionally happens. It's really pretty rare. What we try to do with families that think that might be a question for them is encourage them to come and have a night or two in boarding beforehand so that they've experienced it. And we tend to find more at that stage that we have some children who go away going, yeah, actually, I was really homesick and I wasn't sure that I really could make sense of it and those sorts of things, rather than necessarily when they've joined. We tend to find, it's a very, I'm sure these two would say the same, boarding is a very immersive experience. You're engaged with your friends, and actually once you're a day or two in, that's a big difference. I think what's perhaps more common is in the first day or two of boarding, when suddenly it feels like it's been a really big change. That's the moment that you experience that. And I spoke to one of my boarders who started this term, having been in North London, and he sort of said the first 24 hours was pretty grim, to be honest, because I couldn't really work out what I was doing. And then I made a whole lot of friends, and now I'm absolutely loving it. And that was sort of 4 days in or something. But I think that there is inevitably a sort of moment of wheel spin, and I suppose that's why, Tom would speak to the value of full boarding, and why I would do the same. I think that there is inevitably that changeover is the bit that is a little bit more complex. But actually, once they're in and engaged and doing all those things, they're making the most of everything, and they're having a fab time, and they're busy, and they're engaged with their friends. Then they're really very happy.
Okay, I'm going to, rather than all answer the same question, which I think, well, first of all, is there another question from the floor? Great.
How do you figure out whether your child should go full boarding or weekly boarding?
I would say that comes down to what's right for the family and what would work for you. So do the travel arrangements work for you to get to school? And what do you want? So what our parents value from weekly boarding, their child comes in, they have a great time, all their prep's done, any problems, there's a tutor there in the evening that can help them. If they're feeling homesick, we have peer mentors that are in the boarding houses, so they're peers that help support them. If they had any other well-being issues, there's obviously professionals that can help them as well. They often go for a dog walk in the woods and have a chat about why they're feeling homesick or whatever. That's quite common in the beginning. So I would say it really depends on what works for you as a family, and whether weekly boarding suits. But what I would say is it's quite hard to find a model so flexible as what we offer.
We're going to stick to one question per person now. Just
Go and visit the school.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
You'll know if it's right when you visit the school.
I've got a slightly tricky question for someone to have a go at answering. How do you tell that a school is good at safeguarding?
How can you tell from the outside?
Yeah, as a parent visiting, what would you look for?
The only way you can tell anything about a school is to ask as many different people information about that, academic, safeguarding, anything. And what you do is you take everybody's answers with a nice spoonful of sugar or salt. And so that's it. There's no other way of finding out apart from asking, oh, that old Cottesmore parent over there, that person who was the inspector, this headmaster, that person. That's the only way of finding out. Really, really getting on. Obviously, the inspection report, and lots of reviews. So, yeah.
Great. Well, we've run out of time, which is unfortunate because we could talk about this all day, I think. But all the schools are, well, all the panellists are on their stands now, I think. Is that correct?
We're not on a stand. We're at the London Choices Pavilion at 1:15, where our Director of Boarding will be available to talk to. And also James Kimber, who's in the audience, Head of Geography, who can talk to you about academics and other aspects of the school.
You have correctly reminded me that it's a bit of a festival of events to do with boarding today. So there is a Good Schools Guide forum at 12:15 on when and why would you choose boarding. And then there's a reception in London Choices at 1:15 on consider boarding. And then wrongly printed on here, 3:15, I think, is how are boarding schools rethinking pastoral care in the 21st century. Yeah, that's at 3 o'clock, sorry. That time is wrong on the back. Yeah. Great, thank you very much.
Can I take the opportunity to thank Guy? These wonderful people are very rarely thanked. So I'm going to thank Guy, and I'm going to thank you both very much for a lovely chat. Personally, could have gone on, probably you can see I could have gone on for another 2 hours, but didn't under Guy's instruction. So I hope we did well. But thank you very much, Guy, and thank you very much to the Independent Schools Show. Thank you.
And thank you all.